The morning light had a particular quality that day, thin and wan, sifting through the half-closed blinds of Claire Donovan's bedroom in a way that made the dust in the air look almost deliberate, like tiny suspended lanterns in a hall too quiet to be inhabited. She had never noticed how quiet the house could be before the sun fully rose, how the absence of her own movements and the familiar hum of the heating system allowed even the faintest creaks to resonate as if amplified by intention. The smell of lingering coffee from the night before mixed subtly with the faint musky scent of her old wool blanket, which had been tucked too tightly around her shoulders. The room felt simultaneously intimate and alien. She shifted slightly in bed, noticing the chill of the mattress through the thin cotton sheets, a reminder that winter was still claiming its hold on the house. Claire sat up, rubbing her eyes, trying to remember what had stirred her from sleep. At first, she thought it was a dream, some vague recollection of moving through unfamiliar corridors with a sense of being followed, but the sensation lingered, pressing into her chest as if the air itself had weight. She swung her legs over the side of the bed and let her bare feet meet the cool wooden floor, feeling the grain press against her soles. There was an odd tension in the quiet, the sort that usually preceded some minor explainable disturbance, a fallen picture frame, an open window, or a phone vibrating somewhere in another room. Her first step into the hallway revealed nothing unusual except that she noticed the way the morning light painted the walls a muted gold, highlighting tiny imperfections in the plaster that she had never truly observed before. She frowned at one such blemish, thinking she might call a handyman at some point, and then froze mid-step. A door stood at the far end of the corridor, one she had never seen before, its presence both absurd and undeniable. It was not the right size for any practical use, slightly narrower than the other doors in the house, and the wood had a subtle uneven grain, darker than the surrounding trim. The knob gleamed faintly, even though the sun did not catch it directly. Claire approached it cautiously, her mind insisting on logic while her instincts whispered otherwise. She ran her fingers lightly over the surface. The wood was smooth and cold, almost unnaturally so, and there was a faint scent of something earthy, like damp soil or moss emanating from its edges. The hallway felt longer than it had the night before. The familiar rhythm of the house, the low hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, the distant drip of a leaky faucet, seemed to recede as if the door had absorbed some portion of the everyday noise. Claire leaned closer, pressing her ear against the wood. She could hear nothing beyond the faint, almost imperceptible ticking of the wall clock in the living room. Yet the silence felt wrong, the kind of silence that carries the weight of waiting. She stepped back, running a hand through her hair, the fine strands sticking to her fingers with residual sleepiness, and wondered if she had simply forgotten the door, if it had always been there, hidden in the corner by some quirk of her own inattentiveness. But no matter how she strained to remember, the memory refused to present itself. The rest of the house seemed subtly altered. The air felt heavier, the familiar arrangement of furniture slightly skewed, as though reality had shifted in the night while she slept. The couch in the living room leaned just enough to catch her attention, the rug underfoot curling at one corner as though curling toward the new door's presence. There was a persistent chill that did not correspond to the heater's settings, a creeping coolness that moved along the edges of the walls, brushing her skin like the faintest whisper. Even the light from the kitchen window appeared sharper, revealing the faint texture of the glass in a way that made her wonder if someone had replaced it while she wasn't looking. Claire's gaze returned to the door. Its position made no sense architecturally. There should have been a blank wall where it now stood, a small stretch of hallway that led to nothing. She leaned her head sideways, squinting, tracing the outline of the frame with her eyes, and felt a twinge of vertigo, a subtle lurch in her stomach, as though her internal sense of balance recognized a disruption her conscious mind could not yet articulate. There was a peculiar smell now, faintly metallic, mingling with the earthy note she had noticed earlier. She inhaled carefully and found herself holding her breath for a moment, uncertain if she had imagined the scent entirely. It lingered in the nostrils, leaving a curious aftertaste, like wet stone or old pennies. Her steps toward the door were hesitant, each footfall measured against the persistent stillness of the house. As she drew closer, she noticed the floorboards beneath her shifting slightly, a subtle unevenness that suggested either an aging structure or something deliberately placed there to unsettle her balance. She paused, kneeling to inspect a single board near the doorframe. There were faint scratches, almost like claw marks, but too deliberate to be natural. She traced them lightly with a fingertip, feeling the jagged splinters graze her skin, and felt a shiver run up her spine. The hallway beyond the door appeared darker than the surrounding rooms, though the morning light still spilled generously elsewhere. It was not darkness in the absence of light sense, but rather a shadowed quality, like looking into a room that had been sealed for months and was only partially illuminated through a crack in the ceiling. Claire's fingers tightened around the doorknob. It was warmer now, subtly pulsing under her grip, as though the metal itself had absorbed some small fragment of life. She hesitated. The logical part of her mind argued that it must be a trick of perspective, a misalignment of the house's angles, or perhaps a prank orchestrated by her brother when he had visited last. The irrational part of her mind, however, whispered that something about this door was different in a way she could not yet comprehend. Turning slightly, she noticed three things almost simultaneously, each a fragment of unease. First, a small framed photograph had fallen from a side table in the living room. It depicted her as a child standing in front of a lake on a summer morning, but the water in the background was impossibly still, unnaturally glass-like, reflecting a sky that was neither entirely day nor entirely night. Second, a faint trace of mud marred the hardwood floor leading toward the kitchen. It was recent, the dampness barely visible under the morning light, yet her slippers were clean. Finally, the scent lingered, a trace of something sweetly pungent, like rotting fruit or overripe apples, emanating from the corner of the hallway opposite the door. Each clue felt insignificant on its own, yet together they formed a quiet insistence that something had shifted while she slept. Claire's heart began to pick up a rhythm she could almost hear over the ambient silence, each beat like a hammer against a fragile membrane of normalcy. She leaned against the wall, feeling the textured wallpaper scrape against her palm. The texture, once comforting, now felt abrasive, rough, like the surface of bark. The ceiling above her appeared slightly lower than usual, though she knew this was impossible. She felt the walls narrowing subtly, pressing in. But the pressure was not physical. It was psychological, the sensation that her own home had grown a new consciousness overnight. Her breathing became more deliberate, shallow at first, then deeper, as she tried to ground herself. She noted the way the shadow cast by the door fell unevenly across the floor, the angle inconsistent with the sunlight streaming through the blinds. She crouched briefly to examine the line where shadow met wood and noticed the tiniest movement at the corner of her eye. A flicker, a brief distortion, almost like the air itself had shifted or a reflection somewhere just beyond her peripheral vision. She looked again. Nothing. Yet the memory of it clung to her mind, forming a residue of suspicion and dread. The door had no keyhole, no sign of hinges, yet the knob turned smoothly in her hand. There was a coldness behind it, a silence that seemed to stretch endlessly inward. She pressed her palm against the wood again, feeling a vibration, a faint resonance that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. The sensation was subtle but undeniable, as though the door itself were alive, waiting for her to acknowledge it. She stepped back, her hand still grazing the surface, and considered calling someone. But who could she call for a door that had not existed yesterday? And even if someone came, would they see it? Or would she be dismissed as imagining things? The house around her remained unnervingly still. The refrigerator hummed softly, the faucet in the kitchen continued its slow drip, and yet there was an oppressive quality to the air, a density that pressed into her lungs with every breath. She could hear her own heart in a way that was intimate and terrifying, a reminder of her aloneness. Yet the house was not empty, not entirely. There was a subtle sense of being observed, a presence just beyond the threshold of perception, teasing the corners of her awareness. The hairs on her arms stood on end. She shivered despite the heater, the chill crawling down her spine like water tracing the vertebrae. Claire's mind raced, cataloging possible explanations. Perhaps it was a hallucination induced by stress or lack of sleep. Perhaps the previous night's late dinner and wine had left residues of disorientation. Yet the intensity of the door's presence, the subtle movement of shadows, the faint, earthy smell, it all seemed too deliberate, too coherent to dismiss. Her thoughts flickered to the photograph, the mud, the scent, and a creeping hypothesis formed. Perhaps the door was not merely a door. Perhaps it was a boundary, a threshold to something familiar yet alien, a place where the ordinary rules of her house, her reality, might bend in ways she could not yet predict. A sudden draft brushed her cheek. It carried the scent again, faint but unmistakable, like a rotting orchard on the edge of memory. She turned sharply, half expecting to see the source, yet there was nothing in the hallway. The feeling of being watched intensified, the unseen presence curling around her like smoke. She pressed herself against the wall, letting the cold plaster seep into her back, a grounding sensation, and stared at the door. Its surface seemed to pulse faintly in the shifting light, the dark grain catching shadows that were not entirely consistent with her surroundings. Her hand returned to the knob almost instinctively. The texture of the metal was oddly familiar, unnervingly intimate, like the touch of her own skin reflected in cold alloy. The hallway stretched in a way that made her question the distance she had just walked, the doorway receding, and advancing subtly as she moved her gaze. She felt a vertigo of perception, the sense that her own home had grown a secret within it while she slept. As she lingered, a faint sound reached her ears, a whisper almost lost beneath the silence like the rustling of a single leaf in a vast forest. She strained to locate it, stepping carefully closer, the wooden floorboards groaning softly underfoot. The sound ceased as soon as she moved, leaving only the persistent quiet, a quiet that now felt like a threat. Her pulse accelerated. The shadows along the wall seemed to stretch slightly, curling inward toward the door. She could almost see them shift in time with the subtle vibration she had felt earlier in the doorknob, an imperceptible dance of darkness and motion that defied logic. Claire's awareness of her own body sharpened in response. Every nerve ending seemed heightened, the prickling of her skin under the faint draft, the roughness of the wallpaper, the subtle unevenness of the floorboards, the persistent echo of her own breath. She imagined herself stepping through the doorway, and the world beyond it seemed to warp, the familiar geometry of a house dissolving into uncertainty. Something waited on the other side, and though she did not yet know its shape or intent, she knew it was both familiar and alien, a mirror of her own domestic reality, but subtly off-kilter in ways that hinted at revelation or danger. And yet, she did not turn away. The pull was magnetic, a combination of fear and curiosity so strong it bordered on compulsion. She inhaled again, the sense of earth and decay lingering in her nostrils, the light of the morning sun illuminating the grains of dust that floated lazily in the air. The photograph, the mud, the smell, all unresolved mysteries hung in her mind like faint stars in an overcast sky, guiding her attention to the door even as logic screamed for caution. Her hand trembled as it rested again on the knob. She could feel the cold pulse beneath her fingers, subtle but undeniable, in sync with the quickening of her own heartbeat. The hallway seemed to hold its breath along with her, every shadow elongated, every sound muted, as if the house itself waited to see what she would do. She leaned closer, the wood pressing against her forehead, and a faint sense of vertigo overcame her, a sensation that her body was too large for the hallway, too solid for the space it occupied. Time stretched. She became aware of a faint buzzing at the edge of her hearing, a resonance that she could not place, emanating perhaps from the door itself, perhaps from her own nervous system. The sun's light shifted slightly, and she noticed the shadows along the walls now flickered independently of the sun, moving with a deliberate rhythm. Her pulse quickened, matching the tempo of the imperceptible dance, and then she realized, with an almost shocking clarity, that the door had not simply appeared. It had always been there, waiting, concealed in plain sight, until some subtle shift in her perception or the house itself allowed it to emerge. The notion was both comforting and terrifying, suggesting order, but implying intent, that some aspect of the house had agency, had chosen to reveal this threshold precisely now. The notion unsettled her deeply, planting a seed of dread that curled tightly in her stomach. Claire inhaled one final time, the mingling odors of decay and earth clinging to her senses, and felt the weight of the unseen watching presence pressing closer, patient, expectant. The door waited, the house waited, and somewhere within her a quiet insistence whispered that the moment she crossed the threshold, nothing would be the same again. She reached for the knob, The chill beneath her palm intensified, and the shadows stretched further, darker, heavier. The faint whisper returned, impossibly close now, brushing her ear like a secret just beyond articulation. She felt her body stiffen, every sense taut and alive, every instinct screaming both warning and invitation. And as her fingers curled fully around the cold metal, the house itself seemed to lean in, holding its breath, as though the world beyond the door waited just on the edge of consciousness. Claire's heartbeat thundered in her chest, inescapable and insistent, a warning she could neither ignore nor fully understand. She exhaled slowly, deliberately, tasting the metallic tang of tension in her mouth. Then she turned the knob, and the door began to open with a soundless, impossible smoothness. Beyond the frame, darkness awaited. Claire froze at the threshold, the cold metal of the doorknob pressing insistently into her palm, a pulse she felt in tandem with her own heartbeat. She hesitated, the faint scent of earth and decay curling in the air like smoke from an unlit fire. Her hand trembled slightly, and she drew a shallow breath, as though breathing too deeply might summon something she was not yet ready to confront. The hallway behind her seemed impossibly long, the shadows along the walls stretching toward the door, teasing her peripheral vision. She gave herself one last mental shake and pushed the door open, stepping into the darkness beyond. The room she entered was like a memory she couldn't place. Familiar shapes lurked in the gloom, the curve of a chair, the outline of a bedside table, but everything was subtly wrong, slightly tilted or elongated as if seen through water. The air was heavy, moist, carrying the same earthy tang that had come from the door, and the dim light that managed to filter in through a high window seemed filtered through an invisible veil. Claire's fingers brushed against a wall, feeling the rough texture of plaster where she expected smooth paint. Her instincts flared, the tension in her chest tightening, as if the air itself pressed against her ribs. She advanced slowly, each step measured, listening to the faint sound of her own movement against the wooden floor. The floorboards groaned under her weight, a subtle echo that made her startle despite the silence surrounding her. And then she saw it, herself, lying on a bed at the far end of the room, asleep. Every detail was her own. The slope of her shoulders, the line of her jaw, the slight curl of hair across her forehead. But somehow, the stillness of that other self was wrong, unnervingly perfect. Claire froze, every instinct screaming caution, but her curiosity pressed her forward, an invisible pull she could not resist. Her eyes roamed over the figure on the bed, noting the way the chest rose and fell, the subtle twitch of a finger, the familiar crease in the fabric of the nightshirt she always wore to bed. The familiarity was both comforting and horrifying. Her mind flickered to her last memory of falling asleep in her own room, and the impossible truth hit her. The other Claire was not a memory, not a reflection. She was present, tangible, a mirror of her own form suspended in sleep. Claire swallowed, a dry lump forming in her throat. She took a cautious step closer, the floorboards protesting softly, each creak a loud announcement in the otherwise still room. Her own reflection in the darkened window behind the bed made her jump. She had expected to see only herself, but the reflection seemed slightly delayed, a fraction of a second behind her movements, as if watching with mild curiosity. A cold prickle crawled up her spine. She backed away, the scent of damp earth intensifying, mingling now with a faint metallic tang that reminded her of iron filings. She turned to inspect the room more carefully, tracing her fingers over the surfaces. Every object was familiar yet subtly altered. The clock on the bedside table ran backward for a fraction of a second before returning to its normal rhythm. The books on the shelf leaned at odd angles. The floorboards beneath the bed seemed to pulse faintly. Claire's pulse quickened. Something about this place was alive in a way that her mind refused to label. A sound drew her attention, a faint rustle, soft, deliberate. She looked down and saw a small envelope, cream-colored and unmarked, resting against the base of the bed. Her fingers hovered above it. Something in her gut urged her not to touch it, yet curiosity demanded that she lift it. The paper was cool, smooth, heavier than expected, and when she opened it, the handwriting inside was unmistakably hers, yet the words were not familiar. A single phrase, cryptic, urgent, and unnerving, urging her to remember what she left behind. Claire's breath caught. Her mind raced through her past, her dreams, half-formed memories, trying to place what she had supposedly left behind, but nothing concrete came. She heard the faint sound again, this time more insistent. Turning toward it, she realized it was a voice, low and melodic, yet unmistakably hers, calling her name. She spun toward the bed, and the other Claire shifted slightly, a subtle shiver moving through the sleeping form. Panic rippled through her chest. Her hand trembled as she gripped the edge of the bed, the rough fabric scraping her palm. She took a cautious step closer, compelled and terrified, and leaned over the other self, brushing a strand of hair back from the pale forehead. The movement seemed to trigger something. The sleeping Claire's fingers twitched, then curled around the edge of the blanket, and for a moment Claire thought she saw the faintest smile. She drew back, uncertain, heart hammering, and stumbled toward the corner of the room, pressing against the wall. Her thoughts churned, a storm of disbelief, fear, and the faint glimmer of recognition that this was no ordinary mirror image. This other self represented a past she had forgotten, a version of herself she had suppressed, yet here it was, tangible, watching, waiting. Claire took several steps backward, almost tripping over a chair she had not noticed before. She leaned against the wall, pressing her palms into the plaster, feeling the rough surface bite against her skin. She realized that every sound, every scent, every subtle flicker of shadow was amplified, heightened in a way that left her senses taut and raw. The room seemed to respond to her presence, the shadows stretching, the light dimming, the air growing heavier. She forced herself to speak, her voice low, trembling, seeking to ground herself in reality. She asked questions framed as statements, uncertain whether the other Claire could hear. What was happening here? Who had placed her in this room? Was this some elaborate trick, a hallucination, a dream she had wandered into? The only response was the faint rustling of fabric and the irregular beat of the clock, its hands ticking forward and backward with a rhythm that made her stomach lurch. Her fingers brushed over the envelope again. She tore it open, scanning the words once more, looking for hidden meaning, clues, anything to anchor her. The handwriting, hers but not hers, seemed to pulse in the dim light, shifting slightly when she blinked, moving like a living thing beneath her gaze. Her mind raced, remembering a conversation with her best friend Daniel just weeks before about the fleeting moments of self we lose, the memories we bury. She had laughed then, dismissing the thought as overly dramatic, but now the memory twisted, pressing against the surface of her consciousness, threatening to erupt in fragments of recognition she could not quite hold. Her ears caught another sound, a soft scrape, a footstep behind her, though when she turned, the room remained empty. She blinked, shook her head, telling herself it was the creaking of the old house, a trick of shadows. But the metallic tang in the air intensified, sharper now, more insistent. Panic surged. Claire's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the bed again, steadying herself, trying to breathe, trying to anchor herself in rational thought. She moved around the bed cautiously, noticing details she had missed before. A small mirror hung crookedly on the far wall, its reflection warped, exaggerating angles, elongating her own shadow. She approached it, and in the glass she saw a movement, a flicker of herself standing behind the bed, hands folded across her chest, eyes wide, but she was alone. Her breath caught. The mirror reflected something she did not remember, a fragment of herself from years ago, a face she had buried beneath layers of routine and safety. The envelope slipped from her fingers, landing on the floor with a soft thud. She bent to retrieve it, and in that instant, the other Claire stirred, rolling onto her side, facing her. A sudden chill swept through the room, and Claire instinctively stepped back. The motion was fluid, deliberate, yet entirely too familiar. Her stomach lurched as she realized the other Claire's eyes were closed, but the faintest tension around the lids suggested awareness, consciousness, a presence waiting to be acknowledged. Claire turned abruptly at a sudden sound from behind her, the creak of the door she had entered through. Daniel's voice called out, hesitant. He had come looking for her after she had failed to return his messages. Relief and fear collided in her chest as she shouted, explaining in fragmented sentences, gesturing toward the bed, toward the other Claire. Daniel stepped in, eyes wide, scanning the room, taking in the warped angles, the tilted furniture, the subtle, unnerving detail that had escalated her panic. He asked questions, calm but insistent, trying to pull her back from the edge. Was she hurt? Was she imagining things? Claire's explanations tumbled out, frantic, fragmented, her fingers gesturing wildly toward the bed. Daniel leaned closer, examining the sleeping figure, his brow furrowed, voice low as he pointed out details, attempting to rationalize, to normalize. But the unease in the room was contagious, and even as he spoke, Claire felt the air thicken, the shadows stretch, the metallic tang in the air intensify. In the following moments, she and Daniel moved cautiously, circling the bed, whispering theories and questions, each trying to make sense of the impossible. Daniel suggested calling someone, a professional, a therapist, a friend familiar with unusual experiences. But Claire hesitated. Something about the presence of the other self demanded a personal reckoning, an acknowledgement she could not outsource. Her own curiosity pressed forward, desperate to understand, while fear pulled her back, a tug of war that left her trembling. Claire remembered fragments from childhood, her mother's stories about mirrors capturing more than reflection, Daniel's warnings about overthinking, small memories triggered by the warped angles of the room, the metallic scent, the backward ticking clock. She realized she had ignored subtle signs in her own life, the moments where memory faltered, where intuition whispered warnings she had dismissed. The turning point came when she noticed a small handwritten notebook on the nightstand, one she did not remember placing there. Its cover was worn, the edges frayed, and inside were pages filled with her handwriting, notes she did not recall writing, sketches of the house, diagrams, and words repeating a single haunting phrase: she must see herself clearly. Daniel reached for her hand, grounding her, urging her to step back, but she shook her head. The pull toward the other, Claire, was overwhelming. The sleeping figure stirred again, a finger brushing the blanket, a slight shift of the shoulders. Claire felt a sudden, dizzying recognition. This other self was not only a mirror, but a possibility, a version of herself living parallel to memory and choice, a reflection of what might have been or what had been suppressed. As they stepped closer, the room responded subtly. Shadows deepened, the metallic scent sharpened, and the whispering rustle of fabric intensified. Claire felt every nerve ending alight, each sense heightened, the line between perception and reality fraying. She took a deep breath, bracing herself, aware that every movement might provoke a reaction, and that the answers she sought were contained in the sleeping figure just beyond her reach. The envelope fluttered slightly in the draft, drawing her attention, and she picked it up again, scanning the words, memorizing their weight, trying to anchor herself in meaning. Daniel moved to the door, listening, watching, offering quiet reassurance, but the room had shifted. The air now seemed almost viscous, resisting movement, pressing against them both. Claire realized that the moment of recognition had passed its threshold. She could no longer retreat into ignorance. The other Claire would wake, and when she did, nothing would remain the same. Claire's fingers tightened on the envelope, her knuckles white. Every muscle in her body tensed, as if preparing for a confrontation that was inevitable. She glanced down at the sleeping figure once more, tracing the lines of her own face, the familiar curl of hair, the subtle rise and fall of breath, and a shiver of anticipation ran through her spine. Her internal stakes crystallized. She had to understand what this meant, had to confront the truth of her mirrored self. Even as the air thickened, the shadows stretched, and the house itself seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. The whispering grew louder, just beyond comprehension, the metallic tang almost suffocating. Claire's pulse raced, a drumbeat echoing in her ears as she stepped closer to the bed, every step measured, deliberate, eyes locked on the other self. Daniel's hand remained lightly on her shoulder, grounding her, but she could feel the pull between them, the tension radiating in the space, a prelude to the inevitable awakening. The moment hung suspended, taut and fragile, each second stretching, carrying the weight of revelation and dread, leading inexorably toward a confrontation that she could not yet control. Claire inhaled slowly, tasting the metallic tang in the air, the faint earthy decay, and braced herself, fingers trembling over the envelope, eyes locked on the sleeping mirror of herself, knowing that the next breath, the next movement, would change everything. Claire blinked against the dim light of the hallway, her body still taut from the confrontation that had seemed to stretch time itself. The other version of herself had risen from the bed, a slow, deliberate movement, and had smiled, not cruelly, not mockingly, but as if acknowledging a shared, impossible understanding. For a moment, the world tilted, her heartbeat echoing in her ears, and then the other, Claire, stepped back, fading into the shadows at the far side of the room, leaving only a lingering warmth in the air, a trace of presence that was more comfort than threat. Claire sank onto the edge of the bed, her palms pressed to her knees, the rough cotton of the sheets scraping her skin. The envelope lay open beside her, the cryptic words still visible, but their urgency had softened, almost dissolved, leaving only a quiet prompt to remember, to integrate, to reconcile. Daniel hovered near the doorway, hands in pockets, uncertain yet present, a steadying force amid the lingering strangeness. She spoke first, her voice low, trembling, as if testing the air itself. She told him she was okay, that the other self had not harmed her, that the presence had been a mirror, a reflection of choices and fears, not a threat. Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. He asked if she was certain, and she nodded, the muscles in her jaw tight, the pulse in her throat slowing to something that felt human again. They walked together through the room, carefully, noting the subtle shifts in the furniture, the faint metallic tang that still clung to the air. Claire paused at the window, the morning sun breaking fully over the horizon, casting warm light across the warped shadows. She breathed deeply, tasting the crispness of the air, and found herself grounding in the tactile reality of the world she knew, the familiar hum of the house now settling around her. The first thread to unravel was the room itself. Claire ran her hands along the walls, testing each surface, and realized that the textures had returned to normal, that the shadows no longer stretched beyond the source of light. She knelt to inspect the floorboards, finding only the natural grain of aged wood beneath her fingers. The room had folded back into itself. The impossible geometry dissipated, leaving behind only the memory of its strangeness and the residual pulse of wonder. Daniel bent to pick up the envelope, handing it back with a soft smile. He suggested they leave it for now, that some things were meant to remain as questions rather than answers. Claire hesitated, then agreed, tucking it into a drawer in her nightstand. She ran her fingers over the worn wood, feeling the grooves and imperfections, grounding herself in the ordinary, in the tangible. They spoke then, quietly, about what had happened. Daniel admitted he had feared losing her, feared that she might be pulled into something she could not return from. Claire explained the sensation of seeing herself, of recognizing a life she had almost lived, and the weight of memory, half forgotten and half invented, pressing against her mind. Each word between them knit a fragile understanding, a shared acknowledgement that they had survived something inexplicable and remained whole. Later, in the kitchen, the smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the space, warm and reassuring. Claire moved with deliberate care, stirring sugar into her cup, feeling the heat seep into her palms. Daniel watched her, leaning against the counter. He asked what she felt now after everything, and she admitted she felt a mixture of relief and melancholy, a recognition of the lives not lived, the choices not made. She poured coffee for both of them and handed him the cup. The steam curled upward, tangling with the morning light. Daniel smiled faintly, commenting that it was good to see her steady again. Claire acknowledged it with a soft nod, sipping her own coffee, tasting the bitter warmth, grounding herself further in the simplicity of the present moment. A knock at the door startled her, and when she opened it, a delivery man stood holding a package addressed to her. She brought it inside, curiosity mingling with residual tension. Inside the box were photographs she had never seen before, images of her childhood, teenage years, moments she had forgotten, each captured with remarkable intimacy. She recognized herself in the frames, smiling, crying, existing. Among the photographs was a note. Remember who you were, so you can know who you will be. Claire's fingers trembled slightly as she read it, and she felt a wave of acceptance wash over her, a final acknowledgement that memory and self were intertwined, fluid yet resilient. Daniel reached for her hand again, squeezing lightly. He asked if she was ready to put all of this behind her, and Claire nodded, feeling the warmth of connection, the anchoring reality of human presence, suffusing the lingering dread with possibility. They moved together to the living room, settling on the couch. Sunlight pooled across the cushions, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits, reminding her of fragility and resilience simultaneously. Later, she wandered through the house, noticing small details: a cracked teacup on the counter, the softness of a familiar rug, the faint scent of lavender from a dried bouquet in the hallway. Each detail confirmed the integrity of her world, yet she carried the memory of the other room with her, a secret, a recognition of self she could not fully explain, but had made peace with. In the garden, the wind stirred the branches, and Claire watched the interplay of light and shadow on the grass. Daniel stood beside her, commenting on how alive the world seemed after all they had witnessed. She inhaled deeply, tasting the crisp air, and felt the pulse of life around her, fragile but persistent, full of possibility. At dusk, the two sat on the porch, the sky awash of pink and violet. Claire sipped tea, feeling warmth seep into her hands, the cool air brushing against her skin. She asked Daniel if he believed that some mysteries are meant to remain unresolved. He nodded, watching the horizon. She smiled softly, accepting that uncertainty was a part of life, a space for growth, reflection, and choice. As the night deepened, she retreated to her bedroom, closing the door behind her. The envelope remained in the drawer, untouched but present, a reminder of what had passed and what had been learned. Claire lay in bed, fingers tracing the patterns of the blanket, listening to the rhythmic hum of the house settling into the night. The shadows were ordinary now, familiar and unthreatening, and yet, somewhere deep in her mind, lingered the memory of the other self, not as a threat, but as a whisper of possibility, a quiet companion in the corridors of her consciousness. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, the scent of lavender and earth mingling faintly with the night air. Daniel's voice floated from the living room, commenting quietly on the stars, and she smiled in response, comforted by presence, by continuity, by the simple fact of being here, alive, remembered, and whole. Claire slept that night with a sense of fragile completeness, a reconciliation of fear and hope, memory and present, shadow and light. The morning would bring ordinary tasks, sunlight spilling across familiar surfaces, the hum of routine, but she knew something essential had shifted. She had faced herself and returned, carrying the echo of the impossible as a reminder of resilience, of choice, of life unfolding in all its quiet, luminous complexity. The final morning light poured across her bedroom, brushing the walls in gold. Claire rose slowly, barefoot on the warm wooden floor, fingers trailing along the familiar textures of the room. Daniel joined her in the kitchen, the smell of coffee mingling with toast and the faint, earthy scent of plants from the garden. They moved through the ritual of breakfast in companionable silence, each bite, each sip, a meditation on survival, on acknowledgement, on being alive. Outside, the wind moved through the branches, carrying the scent of soil and flowers, the rustle of leaves punctuating the rhythm of life. Claire lingered at the window, hand pressed to the glass, and felt a connection to everything around her, the house, the garden, the world beyond. A subtle smile curved her lips, quiet, knowing. She had seen herself, had survived the confrontation, and had returned to the ordinary with extraordinary insight. Later, she walked through the halls, noticing small signs of life, a crooked picture frame, the texture of wallpaper, the warmth of sunlight on her skin. Daniel followed quietly, offering support, sharing the ordinary moments with her. They laughed softly over trivial things, the sound light, fragile, a balm to lingering tension. Claire felt a profound sense of continuity, an awareness of both mystery and ordinary grace. As evening approached, the house settled around them, shadows lengthening, light softening. Claire lingered in the doorway of her bedroom, hand on the knob, remembering the impossible door, the presence, the mirror of herself. She allowed herself a final glance, a silent acknowledgement. She closed the door behind her and walked into the living room, into life, carrying the echo of wonder, the memory of what had been, and the quiet, luminous hope that the future held both ordinary comfort and extraordinary possibility. The night deepened. Claire lay in bed, listening to the wind, feeling the heartbeat of the house, the pulse of life within and around her. Somewhere in the dark, a subtle stir of memory lingered, but she did not fear it. She had reconciled, integrated, accepted. The world outside beckoned gently, full of light and shadow, choice and reflection. She drifted into sleep with a sense of fragile serenity, the whisper of the impossible folded into the ordinary, and the first glimmer of dawn brushing the edges of tomorrow. And in the quiet, somewhere between memory and reality, the faintest trace of the other, Claire remained, a reminder not of threat, but of possibility, of the paths not taken, and the resilience of a self that had faced itself and emerged whole. Claire's eyes closed fully, her breath steady, the house breathing with her, the world alive and luminous, and the story settled, bittersweet, yet undeniably hers, lingering in the air like the soft, golden light of dawn.